Okay, all right, friends. We were talking about yesterday. Here we go. We were talking about yesterday a person scrimping and saving from his transportation account and being able to take to take whatever's left over and he can pocket it. So generally speaking, Rav Sharaga is very permissive and allows him to do that. And we had quoted earlier above a tshuva from the Sefer Tshuva Me'ahava from Rav Fleckelis, early 19th century, that says that when a woman is given a food allowance and she's and she scrimps and saves, and she's able to sort of deprive herself a little bit so that she has a few pennies left over, she's allowed to keep those. Even though the Gemara says that when normally she has a surplus, she has to return that to her husband. So the chiddush of Reflekalis is that's only when she's eaten and consumed normally. But if she's actually deprived herself, then she's allowed to keep the surplus herself. So, and so therefore so it's considered to be a gift that the employer gives to the employee. So he says in the footnote, the Makor Baruch says, "Ayin b'sefer Mishpatei HaTorah shehevias divrei hatshuva me'ahava hanal." So he says, I refer you to that sefer that makes reference to this tshuva. V'dima es devarav l'nidon didon dim hapol tzir et atzmo v'holach b'regel. That if the employee deprived himself, he could have gone in the luxurious route. He could have taken the private cab, but instead either walked or took a bus. Ozacha b'kesef kamo b'isha shetzir et atzmo shezachta b'moiser hamizonos. So then he's no different from a woman who deprives herself, and as a result of that deprivation, she ends up with leftover money, and that she's allowed to keep. V'im nasa b'chinam az hakesef magia lema'avid kedin moiser mizonos lebal. If, however, he doesn't deprive himself, let's say he's able to get the same quality ride, but figures out a way to do it for free, so then he would have to return the surplus. He would have to return the transportation account allowance to his employer. Omnom das Rabbeinu Hagon hamachaber shlita ain't okay. He says, however, Rav Sharaga is even more liberal. That even if the fellow figures out how to get rides to work and is not depriving himself in any way, even then, the worker, the employee, gets to keep the transportation allowance. And the reason is because it's as if there was an explicit gifting transaction between the employer and the employee. And he says, and therefore, even if the employee has not in any way compensated the guys who pick him up every day for free, nonetheless, the fact that his friend picks him up every day and is doing him a favor, that obligates the guy who's getting the free ride to in some way reciprocate in the future. And therefore, there is some kind of quid pro quo that is taking place. I am indebting myself to the guy who's giving me a free ride. So I will eventually at some point have to pay up, so to speak. So there's an implicit cost. That's exactly right. So that's Rav Sharaga's argument, is that, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as a free ride. The guy, even though he's getting the same quality of service that he would have normally have had to pay for, he's going to eventually have to pay for it in some way. It may not cost him the same amount, but because he's gotten this transportation allowance, he'll probably in some way use at least a portion of that transportation allowance to show his hakaras hatov to the guy who's giving him free rides. And so therefore that also enters into the calculus as well. And then the final footnote that I guess we're going to see in this discussion, actually it's a little bit lengthier of a footnote. Let's take a look what he says. He says that, remember the last paragraph of Sharaga said that you can figure out a system to keep the transportation allowance and take a bus if that's better for you. However, you have to make sure that that's not going to fatigue you when you in getting to work, because if it's going to compromise your physical well-being or your, let's say, alertness on the job, then you're stealing from your employer. Yes. And we can all appreciate that. Yeah. You know, if I, for example, decide to take the bus to work, instead of taking my car, because I want to save the wear and tear on my car, or I want to avoid paying for a cabs, and I'll take a bus instead. But it's going to take an hour instead of 20 minutes, and we all know that means I'm going to have to wake up earlier. It means I'm going to be more drowsy. It means whatever it is. So then that's also a consideration. You wouldn't be allowed to save money at the expense of your employer. Then you're stealing. Yes. Okay. So that's an important caveat. But the way home, where you've already put in a hard day's work, that's much easier to justify taking the bus home if you want to save some money. So he says in the footnote, the Makor Baruch says, "V'lichora hayanir litlot nidon didan b'machloket Rabbeinu Meir v'Rabbeinu Ephraim shehuva b'rosh b'vavakama." So we started this footnote just briefly yesterday. There's a machlokas that's brought between two Rishonim in the Rush. There was a Ma'aseh Shahaya where Ruvain needed to pay money. He owed a debt to a goy, to a Gentile, and he sent Shimon with the money to pay the Gentile. While Shimon is en route to pay back the debt, they discover that the Gentile has forgiven the debt. It's not expecting to be paid back. It's forgiven the debt. The question now is, who gets to keep the money? Is it Ruvain's money that should be returned to him? Or because he already sent it off with Shimon, is it considered now that Shimon gets to keep the money? So you're grimacing. That doesn't make sense to you, right? That Shimon should be able to keep the money. So Rabbeinu Meir says what we probably would have all intuited, that Ruvain gets to keep, that the money goes back to Ruvain, who owed the debt in the first place. He says, because even though, you see, here's the thing. When Ruvain gave Shimon the money, he relinquished ownership of that money as soon as it got into Shimon's hands. He basically said, I'm entrusting you with this money. Give it to Christopher, the guy who lent me the money, and basically he made it hefker at that point. Mm-hmm. But he could say, like the Gemara makes the argument, I didn't make it hefker. Had I known, I would not have made it hefker. Had I known that that this money would be not being used to pay back a debt. So Ruvain relinquished this money on the condition that it was going to get into the goy's hands, not so that Shimon could make money off of this. However, Amnam Rabbeinu Ephraim Shom Cholek al Svarazu, Usfir le da hakesef magil l'Shimon, ki achar Ruvain hevers hakesef l'Shimon for hesiach daitu me hakesef ayin sham divrayim. Rabbeinu Ephraim disagrees, and he says that once Ruvain gave the money to Shimon, he completely recused himself from that money. And therefore, if it turns out that while Shimon is en route, the non-Jew forgives the debt, so then, Shimon can say, well, it's hefker money, I can keep it. Now, va'ayin barash shedacha kol rayos Rabbeinu Ephraim is fear like Rabbeinu Meir. So the Rush disagrees with Rabbeinu Ephraim, this latter opinion, and he holds that the money goes back to Ruvain, the original debtor. V'chein b'toisus b'basra huva divrei harav Rav Peter Disfirlik Rabbeinu Meir, Ba'ayin Sham Barosh Babas Sham Shavi Divrei Harashmat Bashav Disfirlik Rabbeinu Ephraim, Barosh Cholak Alav Disfirlik Rabbeinu Meir. And it seems like the Rashbam disagrees with the Rosh, so there's a big machlokas here. Okay, so he brings down all of the opinions, etc., etc., etc. Nimtza de bedin ze yesh ma'aracha likrat ma'aracha. So it seems like over here we have two significant counter arguments. Is basically what the Makor Baruch is saying. So that on the one side we have a whole group of Rishonim that the money goes back to Ruvain, and on the other side we have a whole group of Rishonim who feel that the money should go to Shimon. Al kolpanim das rov haposkim near kishitas Rabbeinu Meir v'chein sasam shulchan aruch kedei azu. He says, but most poskim hold like Rabbeinu Meir. The lichore, he says, yesh litlos nidan didan b'machlokes hanal. One could perhaps argue that this machlokes sheds light on our discussion. The lefis varas Rabbeinu Meir yesh lomer de hamishalech yecholiton and irake beisi lecha kesef al da'atz shetikach monit avolo al da'at shetelech beregel. He says the employer might be able to make the following argument: when I signed your check to give you a transportation allowance, it was only under the assumption that you were going to be taking taxis, not that you were going to be walking and that you would pocket this money. I would have given you less money if I knew that you were planning on walking. But according to Rabbeinu Ephraim, once the employer relinquishes the check, you could say, well, it's no longer mine. I've given it to you for transportation, and I don't care how you use it. So he says, so based on that, if we paskin like Rabbeinu Meir, that the money does go back indeed to the person who originally wrote the check to pay back the debt, why don't you say the same thing here, that the employer can say, if I knew you were going to walk, I never would have written the check in the first place. Amnam, Amar lanu Rabbeinu Hagon HaMechaber Shlita, the Yesh L'chalik, the Shiny Hasam Shehunatan Lo Kesef Lahavi Lagoy, V'lachenim Agoy L'lokach Hazeh Yesh Lomer Da HaKesef Chazur L'Reshus HaBa'olim, Ki Me'olam Lo Hayatzad Shehashaliach Yizkeh Bo. So he says, but Rav Sharaga told us that it's different. He says, in the case where the Rush is talking about, where a guy sends Shimon to take the money to the Gentile, he assumes that this money is going to be pocketed by the non-Jew. And once the Gentile decides not to pocket the money, it was never his intention to relinquish this money. Aval benidon didan shehamavid hevi kesef lepoil letzarchei hayishi, yesh lomar degam Rabbeinu Meir yodeh shepoil zacha bo afilu mshina et yiur hakesef mima sheha'avid itkavein. But over here, when you provide someone with a transportation allowance, you are not interjecting yourself into the plans of the employee. You basically say, this is one of the perks of the job. You don't have to worry about how you're going to get here. You don't have to worry. Like I know also, my son was just telling me that he used to work for a firm where the firm had limited parking spaces in their building. And they expect the underlings to find their own street parking or pay for their own parking. And only the higher ups get to have a private parking spot. What if the company gives you a parking expense where they pay for a certain number of spots to a parking garage, right? Very common, especially in the big city, right? And you decide, you know what, I'm going to find my own parking spot on the street, and I'll walk the kilometer to get to the office, and I'll pocket the parking expense, because sometimes they would pay it to the parking garage, but sometimes they'll just give you a parking allowance. It's the same kind of situation where the employer doesn't really care how you're going to get to work, as long, again, as you're not compromising your own personal well-being. Upashut benidon didanim, mashalech lo makpid bazeh, L'kuli alma hakesef magia l'shaliach. And therefore, if the employer demonstrates that he doesn't care how the employee is going to use the transportation account, then the employee gets to keep it. And obviously, this is only relevant if later on there are recriminations. When there turns out to be, let's say, a vikuach, he says, if there's, let's say, a conflict. In other words, let's say after I've been doing this for 5 years, I've been riding my bike to work. I like the exercise, I like the fresh air, yada, yada. And the employer all of a sudden comes over to me and says, I just noticed there's a bicycle attached to our building. Is that yours? And I say, yeah, sure, it's mine. He says, well, what have I been paying your transportation account for? What have I been paying for your parking space for? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he says, well, there are a lot, you've never asked me, you've never demanded for an expense account, you've never asked for evidence for parking. So it was reasonable to assume that you didn't care and that this was just one of the perks of the job, that every employee gets a transportation expense or allowance. So the employer says, oh, well, and he's trying to tighten, we said, we're trying to tighten our belts here at work, and you're exploiting my benefaction, and I expect, I'm going to take away your expense account, and I expect you to pay it back, whatever you haven't used. So this halacha is relevant in that scenario, because again, what's reasonable for the employee to assume, what's reasonable for the employer to demand of the employee. Obviously, if contractually everything is spelled out at the beginning, right, that the employer says, for those who can walk, we expect you to walk. For those who can't, we expect you to take the cheapest mode of transportation, submit your bus or subway stubs at the end of the month, and you'll get you'll reimbursed. That's a whole separate story, right? But this is where there's an expense allowance. Okay.
Well, isn't the situation slightly different? Like in the one case, it's an agency. In other cases, more contractual.
Yes, you can definitely make the distinction. But I think what we're trying to extract from there is the person who writes the check, right, so to speak, the proverbial check writer. Does he really care how that money is going to be used, or is he basically detaching himself from that money as soon as he releases the check from his possession? That's really what this is a discussion about. And how much, in other words, how much control do I as an employer want to have over my employees and the way that they use the money that I'm giving to them, right? And it goes back to what I said, as far as the transportation expense. The shul gives me an entertainment account, an entertainment bonus, right? And the shul doesn't really care how I use it, because they know, like if for example, if I never had guests over my house, then I think the shul would have a right to say, why are we giving you this extra X amount of money every month for an entertainment expense if you're never inviting people over your home? Because so then I would have to be answerable. But if I'm having guests, and then someone let's say a new president comes up and he says, well, I want a list of all the people you've invited because I got a complaint that one of our members was never invited over to your house, right? Which I guess when you have 700 people and 700 families in your shul, it could happen. But truthfully, that's one of the reasons why we did the summer kiddushes, is to make sure that, generally speaking, when we invite people over, it's usually, well, we try to have as many people as we can in general, but we also focus on singles, the widows, the people who don't really have a place to go. That's really where, what I feel our Shabbos table should, like, I love you all, but if I've never had you over my house, it's probably because you have your own families and you guys are okay, right? I think I've had you all over the house at some point, but um, uh, yeah, that's usually the clientele we have at our house, or a typical Shabbos, or if there's a special situation. Anyway, so that's that story. Okay, so let's go on now to the next sim, and we'll just learn the shaila. Hizmin tizmoret lachatuna v'ha'ama'alit hayta mikulkelet. Okay, I hired a band for my kid's wedding. The elevator broke. Okay, like this is really getting down to the nitty gritty. Okay, so let's see. Hitchatanti b'shavua she'avar v'hizmanti tizmoret. I got married last week, and the guy, apparently this is the person asking the shaila, was making his own wedding arrangements, and I ordered a band. I think that's what a tizmoret is. Kishihigia hatizmoret l'ulam, when they got to the hall, hitbarer shem ha'alit sheba'ulam mekulkelet v'hayitzorech liskor anashim. So it was revealed that the elevator was broken to get up to the hall, and so it was necessary to hire workers to schlep shiyalu et klei hanigina v'haram kolim kama komot la'ulam. So we needed to hire people to schlep the musical instruments and all of the amps in the sound system. They had to manually carry it upstairs, which of course is labor intensive and it's going to cost more money. So almi mutelet chovat tashlum la'anashim elu. So the question is, who has to pay that extra expense? Is it al bal ha'ulam or alai shehizmanti et hatizmoret? Is it the hall or is it me? The hall could say, who told you to hire such a big band? Why should we have to pay for it, right? You got to schlep up a 10-piece band with this whole sound system and the light show and the DJ and the this and the that, right? We didn't tell you to do that. So why should we have to pay for the extra expense of schlepping it up to our hall? We guaranteed you a hall. We didn't guarantee you an elevator. That, of course, you can easily hear someone making the argument. And the poor guy who's making his wedding is saying, but I booked a hall that had an elevator and your elevator was broken. Why should I have had to anticipate that there would be extra expense because the elevator was broken? Okay, so what say you all? Is this pretty obvious?
Yeah. Well, I'd say, well, the hall has to pay the expenses.
The hall should, yeah, someone mentioned the word contract. Yeah, well, what if it wasn't, what would you say, Marv? What would the guy got?
Maybe the elevator company.
Good luck.
Depends if there's a maintenance contract on it or
Seriously,
not.
it's a negligence on the part of the elevator company.
But that's
There's
from
no
the whole
contract with
side.
anybody, but it's foreseeable that maybe something could happen.
But what if the
Fire.
elevator company, what if the elevator broke on Friday and
Yeah.
wedding was Saturday night?
Look, elevators break all the time.
Yeah.
We know that. So does an elevator company have to pay for added expense?
I'm sure it says in there.
If it's negligence and it's foreseeable.
Well, let's say it wasn't negligence.
Yeah, if there's no
It's
negligence.
just regular
Then it
wear and
wouldn't be
tear.
liable, wouldn't be liable. And also the hall owner, what did he do? You know, like he has an elevator, if he kept up his maintenance things and, and there's no notice of any problem. If everyone's complaining a week before, the elevator's on a glitch or something, and then he didn't do anything, yeah, maybe, okay, I can see that. But you need more facts. Right now, I don't think anybody's liable.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, someone's gonna have to pay.
I don't know, I think you bear the risk, and like,
Don't bring the band up.
seriously, like, somebody doesn't have to be liable to pay, there has to be some breach of contract or some negligence or some, conduct that, foreseeable, not foreseeable. Sometimes stuff happens, right?
Well, I think it's important that somebody paid the workers so Looks
You
like
know,
the
he has
workers
to-
actually pay.
I think you're gonna get some pushback, Marv.
Yeah.
Who's gonna have to pay? Who hired the workers has to pay. That's who it is.
We should do a show called Judge Marv. Okay, anyway. All right, okay, we'll hold it here. We'll pick this up tomorrow. Okay, take care, everybody.
Funny that.